About 6 months ago, I moved into an old house on the edge of town. It was cheap, and I was broke, so it felt like a good deal. The realtor said it had been sitting vacant for years because the previous owner passed away, and the family just never dealt with it. That didn't bother me. I've always liked old houses. They have character history. Plus, I figured any issues could be fixed with a little work. The first few weeks went by without much happening. I spent my time cleaning, painting, and making the place feel like mine. It wasn't until I started organizing the attic that I found it. There was a small door at the far end of the attic wall. It was barely noticeable, blending in with the aged wood, but something about it caught my attention. The door was only about 4 feet high, with a rusty padlock holding it shut. I remember running my hand over the rough wood and thinking it felt colder than the rest of the attic. That was strange, considering the summer heat. I made a mental note to come back to it later and continued with my cleaning. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I went back to the attic with a hammer and chisel, figuring I could break the lock open. It didn't take much effort. The lock was old and brittle, and it snapped easily. Behind the door was a narrow staircase leading down. The air coming from the opening was damp and smelled faintly of rot. I told myself it was probably just a storage space or some weird old cellar. I grabbed my flashlight and started down. The steps creaked under my weight, and the further I went, the colder it got. By the time I reached the bottom, I could see my breath. The room at the bottom was small and completely bare, except for a single wooden chair in the center. There was nothing else, no windows, no other doors, just that chair. I couldn't figure out why anyone would seal off a space like this. It didn't make sense. As I stood there, I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't just the cold or the smell. It was the silence. The kind of silence that presses in on you and makes you feel like you're being watched. I backed out of the room and hurried up the stairs. I locked the attic door behind me and decided I'd had enough exploring for one day. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing that chair in the empty room. I told myself it was just my imagination. Old houses have a way of messing with your head. But then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it. A faint creaking sound, like someone slowly rocking back and forth. It was coming from above me. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, but the sound didn't stop. It had a rhythm, deliberate and steady. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I went back to the attic. The little door was closed, just as I had left it, but the padlock was on the floor, broken in two. I know I didn't put it back, and even if I had, it wouldn't have been able to lock itself. My hands were shaking as I opened the door and looked inside. The staircase was still there, but now the wooden chair was sitting at the base of the steps, facing upward, like it had been waiting for me. I slammed the door shut and left the house. I stayed with a friend that night, trying to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. I even thought about calling the realtor to see if she knew anything about the house's history, but I felt ridiculous. What was I going to say? That I was scared of a chair? When I finally went back, I decided to just ignore the attic altogether. I told myself that if I didn't go up there, nothing could happen. That worked for about a week. Then the noises started again. This time it wasn't just creaking. It was faint whispers, too soft to make out the words, but unmistakably human. I couldn't take it anymore. I went back to the attic with a hammer, planning to nail the door shut. But when I got there, the door was already open. The staircase was gone, replaced by solid wood. It was like the door had never led anywhere at all. The chair, though, was sitting in the middle of the attic now, facing me. I don't know why, but I felt like I had to sit in it, like it was calling to me, pulling me in. I tried to resist, but my legs moved on their own. The moment I sat down, the air around me felt heavy, suffocating. I could hear the whispers again, louder this time, but still just out of reach. I don't remember much after that. When I came to, it was morning, and I was lying on the floor. The chair was gone, and the little door was sealed up like it had never existed. I've tried to leave the house, but every time I pack my things, something stops me. It's not fear or indecision. It's like the house doesn't want me to go. The whispers have started again, louder and more frequent. They're not just in the attic anymore. They're everywhere. I don't know what's going to happen to me, but I have a feeling I won't be leaving. Not really. If you're reading this, don't come looking for the house. Don't try to help me. Just stay away. Some doors are meant to stay sealed. I shouldn't have stayed in the house. I know that now. But at the time, it felt like my only option. My lease was up, my savings were nearly gone, and this old, crumbling place was practically being given away. When I found it listed online, it seemed too good to be true. Turns out it was. The house was in an isolated spot at the edge of a forest. It had been empty for years, and from the outside it looked like it might collapse at any moment. The realtor said the previous owners left suddenly, but she didn't have much else to offer. She called it a fixer-upper and seemed relieved when I told her I'd take it. I should have wondered why. For the first few weeks everything was fine. Sure, the place was drafty, and the pipes groaned like they were alive, but that's what I expected with a house this old. It wasn't until I started cleaning out the basement that I noticed something strange. At the far end of the basement there was a wall that didn't match the rest. It looked newer, like it had been added long after the house was built. The bricks were a different color, and the mortar seemed almost fresh compared to the crumbling stone around it. It felt out of place. I couldn't stop staring at it. I started to wonder why someone would seal off part of a basement like that. It didn't make sense. My first thought was that it might be hiding something valuable, like an old wine cellar or a stash of antiques. I spent hours trying to chip away at the mortar with a screwdriver and hammer, but it was slow going. That wall wasn't coming down easily. One night as I was working, I heard something. At first I thought it was just the wind outside, but then I realized the sound was coming from the wall itself. It was faint, like scratching or tapping, just on the other side. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The noise stopped and I told myself I was imagining things. I went upstairs and tried to forget about it. The next day, I couldn't stay away. Something about that wall wouldn't let me rest. I went back with a crowbar and started prying at the bricks. I worked for hours until I finally broke through. Behind the wall was a small, dark room. The air that came out smelled stale and cold, like it had been trapped for decades. Inside there was a single wooden chest, about the size of a footlocker, sitting in the middle of the room. The chest was covered in strange carvings I didn't recognize, patterns and symbols that made my skin crawl just looking at them. There were chains wrapped around it, secured with a heavy padlock. I should have left it alone. I know that now, but I didn't. I thought maybe the chest was valuable, that it might hold something worth selling. I dragged it upstairs and left it in the living room while I went to find something to cut the chains. That was my second mistake. When I came back, the chest wasn't where I left it. I found it on the other side of the room, the chains rattling slightly as if something inside had moved. I told myself it was impossible, that I must have bumped it and not noticed. I dragged it back to the center of the room and wedged it between some furniture so it couldn't move again. That night I dreamed about the chest. In the dream, the carvings on its surface seemed to shift and writhe like living things. I could hear whispers coming from inside, voices that didn't make sense but filled me with dread. When I woke up, the chest was at the foot of my bed. I don't know how it got there. I don't want to know. I tried to take it back to the basement, but it was too heavy to lift. It's like the chest has grown heavier, like it's rooting itself into the house. The carvings are more pronounced now, deeper, almost like they've been freshly cut. I swear I've seen them move out of the corner of my eye. The noises started again last night. Scratching, tapping, even faint whispers. This time they weren't just coming from the chest, they were in the walls, the floors, everywhere. I feel like the house is alive, like it's watching me. I tried to leave, but the front door wouldn't open. The windows won't budge either. I'm trapped. The chest is still here, and now I can't even look at it without feeling sick. I don't know what's inside, and I don't want what's inside, and I don't want to find out. The whispers are louder now, almost like they're calling my name. I've tried ignoring them, but it's impossible. They're in my head, crawling under my skin. I've boarded up the basement and locked myself in the bedroom, but it doesn't help. The whispers are everywhere. The chest is everywhere. I can feel it, even when I can't see it. It's waiting for me, and I don't think I can fight it much longer. If you're reading this, don't come looking for me. Don't come looking for the house. Whatever is in that chest, it doesn't belong here. It shouldn't exist. I think it's been waiting for someone like me, someone curious and stupid enough to set it free. I'm writing this as a warning. Some rooms are sealed for a reason. Some things are meant to stay hidden. If you ever find a place like this, walk away. Burn it down if you have to. Just don't open the door. Don't break the seal. And whatever you do, don't open the chest. I'm afraid it's too late for me, but maybe it's not too late for you. I wasn't looking for trouble when I rented the old house. I needed a quiet place to write and found this one on a short-term rental site. It was in a small town, tucked away from everything, and I thought the isolation would help me focus. The listing mentioned its charm and history, but nothing about what I would eventually find. The house itself was normal at first glance. 2 stories, a wraparound porch, creaky wood floors, and that faint smell of age-old houses have. The landlord had left a key under the mat and a handwritten note about the Wi-Fi password. Nothing unusual, or so I thought. The first night I noticed something odd. At the end of the upstairs hallway there was a door that didn't match the others. It was taller, narrower, and painted a shade darker than the rest. When I tried to open it, the handle didn't budge. I figured it was just a locked storage closet and didn't think much of it. A few nights later I was sitting at the desk in my room when I thought I heard a noise from upstairs. It was faint, almost like a low hum, coming from the direction of the locked door. I ignored it at first, chalking it up to the old pipes, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, almost like a vibrating hum that you can feel more than hear. I decided to check it out. When I reached the hallway, the sound stopped. The door was just as I had left it, locked and unremarkable, except for one thing. The air around it felt different, colder, as if a draft was leaking through the cracks. I touched the door, and it felt colder than the rest of the house. I tried the handle again, but it was still locked. Over the next week, the noises got worse. It wasn't just the humming anymore. Sometimes it sounded like scratching, faint but deliberate, coming from the other side of the door. I started to have trouble sleeping, constantly on edge, waiting for the next sound to come. It was as if the house was alive and trying to get my attention. One night, I decided I had to know what was behind that door. I grabbed a flashlight and a small crowbar I had in my car. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to break the lock, but I was determined to try. When I reached the hallway, the air felt heavier than before, like the house itself was holding its breath. The lock wasn't as strong as I expected. It broke after a few solid hits, and the door creaked open. Behind it was a staircase, steep and narrow, leading down into darkness. I hadn't noticed before, but the house didn't have a basement, or at least that's what the listing had said. I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The staircase was much colder than the rest of the house, and the air smelled damp and metallic, like rust. My flashlight illuminated stone walls, rough and uneven, as if they had been carved by hand. The stairs seemed to go on forever, deeper than should have been possible. I stopped counting after 20 steps. When I finally reached the bottom, I found myself in a small, circular room. The walls were covered in strange symbols carved deep into the stone. They looked ancient, almost primal, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. In the center of the room was a large, rectangular stone slab like a table or an altar. It was stained dark, and the smell of rust was stronger here. I should have left. Every part of me was screaming to turn around and go back upstairs, but something held me there. As I stared at the symbols, I started to feel lightheaded, like the air was being sucked out of the room. The symbols seemed to shift and writhe under the beam of my flashlight, and I realized I could hear the humming again. It wasn't coming from the room, though. I don't know how long I stood there before I finally forced myself to move. I stumbled back up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me and jamming a chair under the handle. I sat in the hallway for hours, trying to convince myself that it was just an old storage space, that my mind was playing tricks on me. The next morning I tried to act normal. I went into town, grabbed coffee, and pretended everything was fine. But when I got back to the house, the door at the end of the hallway was open. The chair I had used to block it was lying on its side, as if it had been thrown. I didn't go near the door again after that, but things kept getting worse. At night, I could hear footsteps moving up and down the hallway, slow and deliberate. I started sleeping with the lights on, though sleep barely came. The walls seemed to shift sometimes, like the house was changing when I wasn't looking. The symbols I had seen in the basement began appearing in my dreams, etched into my skin, glowing and pulsing with light. On my last night there, I woke up to the sound of something moving in my room. I didn't see anything at first, but the air was freezing, and I could feel something watching me. When I turned toward the door, I saw it. The shadow of a figure, impossibly tall and thin, standing in the doorway. I couldn't move, couldn't even scream. The figure didn't step into the room, but it didn't have to. Its presence filled the space, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. When I finally broke free from the paralysis, I ran. I didn't pack my things or look back. I left the house and never returned. The landlord hasn't contacted me, and I haven't dared to ask anyone about the place. If you ever come across a house like that, with a locked door and strange sounds, don't go inside. Some doors are sealed for a reason, and some secrets should stay buried. Last month I moved into an old Victorian house I inherited from my great aunt. I didn't know her well, and my family never talked about her much. All I knew was that she had lived alone her whole life, and that the house had been locked up since she passed away 5 years ago. It was the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a ghost story, all dark wood and stained glass, with a towering facade that seemed to loom over the neighborhood. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, dusting, and figuring out how to work the ancient heating system. It was while I was exploring the house that I noticed the sealed parlor. The room was at the back of the first floor, its double doors bolted shut with thick iron brackets. The wood around the doors looked newer than the rest of the house, as if someone had reinforced it recently. There was no keyhole, just the heavy brackets and a sense of something waiting on the other side. I asked the lawyer handling the estate if he knew anything about the sealed room. He said he didn't, just that the house had been left exactly as my aunt had kept it. He also mentioned that she had been a private woman, and that it might be best to respect her wishes. That only made me more curious. That night I found myself staring at the doors again. There was something strange about them. The wood felt unnaturally smooth and cold, and when I pressed my ear against them, I thought I heard faint whispers. I told myself it was just the wind or my imagination, but I didn't sleep well that night. A few days later, I decided to open the room. I told myself it was just an old storage space, and I didn't want to waste a perfectly good part of the house. I went out and bought a crowbar, thinking I could pry the brackets off. When I started working on them, though, it felt like the air in the house changed. It grew heavier, thicker, as if the walls were holding their breath. It took me hours to remove the brackets, and by the time I was done, I was drenched in sweat. When I pushed the doors open, I was hit by a wave of cold air. The room was completely dark, and the smell was overwhelming, a mix of dampness and decay. I fumbled for a light switch but couldn't find one. I had to use my flashlight to see. The room was unlike anything else in the house. The walls were covered in black, peeling wallpaper, and the floor was a strange, uneven stone. At the center of the room was an old wooden table with 4 chairs around it. The chairs were all turned inward, facing each other, and on the table was a single, unlit candle. The strange part was the carvings. The walls, the table, even the backs of the chairs were covered in intricate symbols and markings I didn't recognize. They looked ancient, like something you'd see in a book about forgotten languages or pagan rituals. I felt uneasy just looking at them. I left the room as quickly as I could and decided to seal it back up the next day. I wasn't ready to deal with whatever was in there. That night, though, I started hearing things. At first, it was just faint creaking sounds, like footsteps moving slowly through the house. Then came the whispers, too quiet to make out but loud enough to keep me awake. The next morning, I found the doors to the parlor wide open. I know I closed them the night before, and there was no way the wind could have pushed them open. The chairs around the table had moved slightly, as if someone had been sitting in them. The candle on the table had melted a little, even though I hadn't lit it. I tried to ignore it, but things kept getting worse. Every night the sounds grew louder. Footsteps would echo through the house, and the whispers became more distinct. They weren't words I understood, but they had a rhythm, almost like chanting. I started seeing shadows move in the corners of my vision, always just out of reach. One night I woke up to the sound of something heavy scraping across the floor. I grabbed my flashlight and went downstairs, dreading what I would find. The parlor doors were open again, and the table had been dragged halfway out into the hallway. The chairs were overturned, and the candle had burned down to a nub, even though I had thrown it away the day before. I decided I couldn't stay in the house anymore. I packed a bag and planned to leave first thing in the morning. But when I woke up, my bag was empty, and all the clothes I had packed were scattered across the parlor floor. The doors were shut again, the brackets somehow back in place, even though I had left them in a pile by the trash. I don't know how to explain what's happening, but I can feel the house watching me. It's like the parlor is alive, pulling me closer every day. I've tried calling for help, but my phone won't work inside the house anymore. The windows won't open, and the front door won't budge no matter how hard I pull. I don't think I have much time left. The whispers are louder now, and I can hear them calling my name. Last night I woke up in the parlor, sitting in one of the chairs with the candle burning in front of me. I don't remember going there, but I couldn't move until the candle burned out.